June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m. Normandy, France. The gray dawn breaks over the English Channel. A cold wind sweeps across the water, carrying the scent of salt, fuel, and fear. On the horizon, hundreds of silhouettes emerge, landing craft bobbing violently against the waves. Inside them, young American soldiers grip their rifles, faces pale beneath their helmets. Ahead lies Omaha Beach, a narrow strip of sand bordered by cliffs and concrete. Behind those fortifications, German MG-42s wait, barrels fixed on the sea, their crews calm and ready. For months, they've been told that this beach will become a graveyard, that no force could survive a frontal assault here. And as the first ramps drop, machine gun fire cuts through the mist, shredding the silence. Men fall before even touching the sand. From the bluffs, German commanders watch in grim satisfaction. They believe the Atlantic Wall is held, but far beyond their view, beyond the chaos of the surf, a line of American destroyers begins to turn their guns inland. The slaughter is about to turn. The plan for Operation Overlord had been crafted with precision, yet everyone knew that Omaha Beach would be the bloodiest of the 5 landing zones. It was not just another stretch of French coastline. It was a fortress. Rising cliffs, open sands, and a deep tidal zone meant the attackers would be completely exposed. The Germans had spent years transforming it into a death trap. Machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, mortar pits, and interlocking fire zones turned every meter of sand into a killing field. Fields of barbed wire, mines, and wooden stakes waited to tear apart landing craft before they ever touched ground. To the German 352nd Infantry Division, this was their arena, their home turf. They were not green troops. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had fought the Soviets in brutal close combat. Commanded by General Dietrich Kreis, they had rehearsed their defense endlessly, determined that no Allied soldier would leave that beach alive. The Americans who faced them, primarily the 1st Infantry Division, Big Red, 1, and the 29th Infantry Division, knew only fragments of what awaited. Aerial reconnaissance had failed to identify many of the hidden bunkers and camouflaged artillery positions. Planners hoped the preliminary naval bombardment would crush the defenses before the first wave landed. But weather and timing betrayed them. On the morning of June 6th, heavy surf scattered the landing formations. Tanks meant to provide covering fire sank in deep water before reaching shore. The air bombardment, launched too far inland to avoid friendly fire, missed nearly all key targets. By the time the first American troops approached the beach, the defenses were untouched. The German gunners waiting in silence until the boats came close enough to see the white of their helmets. At 6:30, the slaughter began. A storm of bullets tore through the first wave. Within minutes, the surf turned red. Men dove behind sand ridges, corpses, and destroyed craft. Anything that could serve as cover. Officers were killed before giving their first command. Radios were destroyed, leaving entire companies leaderless and isolated. The men who made it ashore found themselves trapped between the water and the cliffs. The tide was rising and the beach offered nowhere to hide. Every attempt to advance was met with devastating crossfire. Many never made it beyond the shoreline. To the Germans above, it seemed their expectations had been confirmed. From the bunkers along Widerstands Nest 62 and Widerstands Nest 72, they could see the wreckage scattered below. Burning vehicles, motionless bodies, and waves still delivering more doomed men. Messages flashed up the chain of command. Enemy landing at Omaha repelled. But deep offshore, chaos and courage collided in equal measure. The fleet's destroyers, small, fast, and heavily armed, had been ordered to hold position miles away from the beach to avoid mines and artillery. From that distance, their guns could barely reach the cliffs. But reports of disaster changed everything. At 7:45, as surviving infantry clung to fragments of cover, signals from beach commanders reached the Navy. They were desperate. "We cannot advance. We are pinned down. We need fire on those positions now." The order went out. Destroyers were to move closer, dangerously close, closer than doctrine, closer than safety allowed. They would risk grounding themselves to save the men on that beach. One by one, ships like USS Carmick, USS McCook, and USS Doyle turned toward the shore. Sailors on deck could see the beach through binoculars, could see the soldiers still alive waving frantically for help. The destroyer's captains knew what that meant. They adjusted course, directly into the shallows. By the time their guns began to fire again, they were less than 1,000 yards from shore, so close that German snipers began shooting at the bridge crews. But the naval guns answered with precision. Every blast shook the coastline. Concrete bunkers cracked. MG-42 nests vanished in clouds of dust and flame. The very earth above Omaha Beach began to tremble under the sustained barrage. For the first time that morning, the German defenders faltered. And for the Americans pinned below, hope flickered amid the smoke. The destroyer's decision to close the distance was one of the boldest naval actions of D-Day, and one of the least expected. They were not meant to fight this close to shore. Each vessel weighed over 2,000 tons, yet they maneuvered through shallow, mined waters meant for small landing craft. Every captain knew that one mistake, one uncharted sandbar, one mine, could mean destruction. But hesitation was no longer an option. From their decks, sailors could see what aerial photographs had never shown: the terrifying geometry of Omaha's defenses. The German guns sat in hardened positions, invisible from above but perfectly aligned with the beach's choke points. Every cove, every draw, every rise of sand had been engineered to trap and kill. As the destroyers advanced, the soldiers of the 1st and 29th Divisions fought to survive below. Small groups crawled from crater to crater, dragging wounded men through rising surf. Their radios were mostly useless. Coordination was chaos. The tide swallowed ammunition, rifles, and even bodies. Officers took cover behind wrecked Higgins boats, trying to make sense of a battlefield that had dissolved into fragments. Then came the thunder. At 8:30, naval shells began to rain down on the bluffs. The first salvos overshot, then quickly corrected. Soon their fire grew terrifyingly accurate. From the beach, soldiers could see shells slamming directly into the mouth of German bunkers. Entire fortifications vanished under clouds of debris. It was the first time in hours the defenders had paused their machine gun fire. On the destroyer USS Carmick, Lieutenant Commander J.B. McDonough ordered his ship to within 800 yards of the beach, a suicidal distance for a vessel that size. At that range, the guns were firing point blank into concrete. Every shot echoed off the cliffs like thunder rolling through a canyon. Nearby, USS McCook and USS Doyle joined the barrage. The coordination between Navy gunners and beach spotters, mostly by line of sight or hand signals, became a lifeline. If soldiers could point, wave, or fire tracer rounds at a bunker, the destroyers would take aim and obliterate it. German observation posts, now under direct fire, began to collapse. Telephone lines were cut, commanders killed or buried alive. The precise coordination that had made the German defense so deadly began to unravel. By 9:00, several of the key strongpoints guarding Omaha, including Whiterstandsness 60, 61, and 72, had been silenced or severely damaged. It was in these fragile minutes that American initiative reawakened. Small units no longer pinned down began crawling up the draws that led inland. Sergeants and corporals, many taking command after officers were killed, started leading men up the cliffs. In some places, only a handful reached the top, but their success cracked the entire defense line. German positions designed to face the beach were now being attacked from behind. Amid the chaos, leadership mattered more than rank. At the Vierville draw, a group of engineers blew gaps through the beach obstacles, clearing narrow lanes for reinforcements. At Les Moulins, remnants of several companies regrouped under the cover of naval fire and began pushing inland, house by house. And at Colleville-sur-Mer, a young lieutenant named Jimmy Monteith repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to organize men for a breakout, actions that would later earn him the Medal of Honor. By 10 Ombre-Dinau, smoke blanketed the shoreline. Waves still crashed onto debris and bodies, but the gunfire from the cliffs had thinned. For the first time, the Americans were gaining ground, not through overwhelming numbers, but through sheer will and the deafening support of the ships behind them. The destroyers continued firing until their barrels glowed red. They had burned through thousands of rounds of ammunition, much of it at near point-blank range. The crews were deafened, their decks littered with spent shells, but they could finally see results. Men moving, advancing, fighting back. What had begun as a massacre was transforming, minute by minute, into a turning point. Behind the beach, General Omar Bradley, commanding from the cruiser Augusta, received word that the tide might finally be shifting. Initial reports of total failure began to change tone. Forward observers reported movement inland. Communications remained fragmented. But one message cut through clearly. Infantry advancing through the draws. The destroyers had done what heavy bombers and hours of planning could not. They had broken the stalemate. And as more men reached the top of the cliffs, they discovered the once dreaded German strongpoints shattered and abandoned. Omaha Beach had not been won by plan or perfection. It had been won by defiance, by soldiers who refused to die on the sand and sailors who dared to bring their steel ships where no one believed they could survive. Omaha was not just a battlefield, it was a test of human endurance. When the first waves landed, there was no cover, no coordination, no rhythm, only chaos and courage. Men from the 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division faced the worst landing conditions of all 5 invasion beaches. Their amphibious tanks had sunk in rough seas. Their landing craft were scattered by tides and currents. Entire platoons found themselves hundreds of yards off course, facing enemy strongpoints they had never studied on a map. Survivors described the horror in words, stripped of sentiment. Riflemen saw comrades cut down before even reaching the surf. Medics tried to treat wounds with seawater washing over them. And yet, amid the paralysis, something extraordinary happened. Leadership emerged from the lowest ranks. Sergeants began taking charge when officers fell. Corporals gathered fragments of units, shouting through explosions to rally whoever could still hear. In moments when communication was impossible, instinct took over. Men moved not because they were ordered to, but because they refused to die doing nothing. Every few meters forward was earned through blood. Each crater in the sand became a temporary home, a sanctuary from fire, a place to breathe before the next sprint. What began as terror slowly turned into focus. A soldier later recalled, "We stopped thinking about surviving. We started thinking about getting to those cliffs." It was this shift, from fear to purpose, that marked the human victory at Omaha long before the beach was fully secured. The landings at Omaha revealed both the brilliance and fragility of Allied planning. The original operation called for a synchronized assault, precise timing between infantry, armor, engineers, and air support. But tides, fog, and enemy fire dismantled that symmetry in minutes. What remained was improvisation, raw adaptability. Without functioning radios, the beach became a series of isolated micro-battles. Infantrymen learned to signal destroyers with mirrors or colored smoke. Tank crews who had somehow made it ashore used their wrecks as partial cover for advancing troops. When engineers cleared mines and obstacles, others followed with flamethrowers and grenades, clearing bunkers one at a time. Nothing resembled the rehearsed version of D-Day, yet it worked, precisely because men refused to adhere to failure. The destroyers' close-in fire became the tactical hinge that allowed this improvisation to succeed. By eliminating key German emplacements, they turned Omaha from a killing zone into broken terrain. Each destroyed bunker was not just a victory in itself, but a breathing space, a chance for American troops to regroup, plan, and strike back. The shift from paralysis to initiative defined the battle's tactical brilliance. It was not the absence of fear that saved the day, but the presence of adaptation. If Omaha Beach was hell on land, salvation came from the sea. The U.S. Navy's destroyers, ships like USS Carmick, McCook, Harding, Satterley, and Doyle, fought a battle every bit as desperate as the soldiers they protected. The order to move closer had not come from high command. It came from captains on the spot who understood the situation was collapsing. Through periscope rangefinders and naked eyes, they aimed their guns with precision rarely seen in naval warfare. Targets were so close that gun captains could see German muzzle flashes and adjust instantly. At one point, USS Satterley fired directly into a cliff bunker less than 1,000 yards away, its shells exploding just meters above friendly troops. Every destroyer that advanced risked grounding or detonating a mine, yet not one turned back. Their fire not only silenced the enemy, but restored morale to the men below. One infantryman later wrote, "When those shells came in over our heads, we knew we weren't alone anymore." These destroyers became floating artillery, changing the nature of amphibious warfare. Their actions would later be studied as examples of independent initiative, proof that in war, discipline must sometimes yield to courage and judgment. Leadership at Omaha was not centralized. It was born in chaos. Major General Norman Cota, deputy commander of the 29th Division, was one of the first senior officers to step onto the beach. He found men paralyzed behind cover, pinned down by relentless machine gun fire. Cota's words, shouted over the roar of battle, became legend. "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." His defiance cut through the paralysis. Cota moved from group to group, inspiring soldiers to push forward through fire, clearing obstacles by hand and grenade. Similar acts of leadership rippled across the beach. Lieutenants, sergeants, even privates taking command when the chain of command collapsed. This mosaic of initiative turned what could have been annihilation into survival, and then victory. At higher levels, naval commanders like Commander Ernest Evans and Lieutenant Commander McDonough displayed the same spirit. Their decisions to move their ships inshore were not ordered. They were instinctive, grounded in duty and courage. Leadership at Omaha, from the sand to the sea, was not about command from above, but action from within. From the German perspective, Omaha Beach began as a triumph. Observers from the 332nd Infantry Division, stationed along the bluffs, watched the first Allied waves disintegrate under fire. Reports sent to regimental headquarters described the beach as completely controlled, the assault as repelled. To the defenders inside their concrete bunkers, the view was horrifyingly one-sided, waves of men falling in the surf, tanks burning and landing craft drifting aimlessly. But within hours, that confidence turned into confusion. The first sign came when German gun crews noticed their targets disappearing, not because they had fled, but because destroyer fire had obliterated the firing positions themselves. One artillery observer wrote later, "The sea began to answer us. Each time we fired, something answered back with greater precision. By midday, communication between strong points had broken down. Wires were cut, radios jammed, and runners were killed crossing the open slopes. The once coordinated defense fragmented into isolated cells. Every bunker fought alone, unaware that neighboring positions were already silent. When American destroyers shifted to point-blank range, even hardened German veterans were stunned. Naval shells designed to pierce ship hulls tore through concrete as if it were paper. Machine gunners abandoned positions that had been fortified for years. What had begun as mockery, "The Allies are drowning in their own invasion," became disbelief. The invincible Atlantic Wall was cracking under the weight of relentless naval fire and infantry grit. By nightfall, German commanders no longer spoke of holding the beach. They spoke of survival and retreat. For the men on Omaha, survival depended as much on the mind as on muscle. Fear, exhaustion, and disbelief could paralyze, but so could determination if not controlled. Veterans later described a strange transformation. The noise became background, the fear became focus. When leadership failed, adrenaline and instinct filled the void. One infantryman recalled crawling past bodies and realizing he felt nothing, not horror, not anger, just calculation. Each crater, each dune, each corpse became a landmark in a silent map of survival. In that space between terror and numbness, the American soldier became something else, a force of persistence. Psychologists studying Omaha years later found a pattern. Group survival depended not on who commanded, but on who acted. Small teams, 4, 5, sometimes just 2 men, operated autonomously, guided by a shared belief that someone had to keep moving forward. That collective determination broke the psychological stalemate that the Germans had intended to maintain. When destroyer shells began hitting German positions, morale shifted in an instant. The soldiers on the sand realized the tide had turned, not just physically but mentally. Suddenly, it was the defenders who were trapped. The same bluffs that had once provided protection became cages under naval bombardment. The battle for Omaha was fought in the mind as much as in the mud, a test of which side would break first. In the end, it wasn't the best equipped or best positioned that prevailed, but those who refused to break at all. The destruction of Omaha Beach carried moral weight unlike any other battle of D-Day. Each bunker stormed meant dozens of men killed at close range, sometimes hand-to-hand. Each naval bombardment risked hitting not only enemy defenses but friendly troops already on the slopes. Decisions were made in seconds without perfect information, under impossible pressure. The destroyer captains faced the same dilemma from sea. Their guns could save hundreds on the beach, but a misfire or wrong coordinate could annihilate them instead. Yet time after time they chose to act. It was not recklessness, but conviction that inaction would be the greater sin. For the infantry, the moral calculus was simpler but no less heavy. They fought not for territory but for each other. The objective, the bluffs above Omaha, became secondary to survival and duty. A soldier later said it wasn't about the war anymore. It was about getting one more man off that beach. These choices, made in seconds and forgotten in minutes, defined the moral dimension of Omaha. The victory came not just through courage, but through conscience, the willingness to risk everything for those beside you. The price was terrible. Thousands lay where they fell, their sacrifice marking the thin line between catastrophe and triumph. But through their endurance, the impossible became possible. That night, when silence finally fell over Omaha, it was not victory that soldiers felt first. It was disbelief. They had survived what was supposed to be their end, and somewhere offshore, the destroyers that had saved them drifted quietly, their barrels still smoking in the dark. The stage was now set for the climax, when the tide truly turned, and the destroyer's defiance reshaped the fate of the entire Normandy invasion. 900 hours, June 6, 1944, off the coast of Normandy. The sky trembles with the echo of artillery. The sea churns with blood, smoke, and shattered metal. Every wave carries a story, some ending before it begins. Omaha Beach, the heart of D-Day, is burning alive. The men of the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions are pinned flat against the sand. German MG-42s sweep the beach like mechanical scythes, cutting down anyone who dares to move. Every dune, every rock is under the gaze of a hidden gun. Command posts are silent, radios drowned by static and panic. From offshore, the U.S. destroyers can see it all through binoculars. The smoke, the chaos, the bodies. The beach isn't advancing. It's dying. Reports come in. We're losing Omaha. The first wave is nearly annihilated. The second is trapped. The Germans, from their bunkers and gun nests high above, believe they've won. At Point du Hoc, the cliffs glow red with tracer fire. General Bradley, aboard the command ship Augusta, stares in silence. The naval bombardment had ceased hours ago to avoid hitting friendly troops, but those troops are going nowhere. On the radio, his voice is grim. If someone doesn't do something soon, we'll have to pull them off that beach. Then, aboard the destroyer USS Satterley, a decision is made that breaks every rule of naval doctrine. Commander Lieutenant Commander Joe McCarthy looks toward the shore, only 800 yards away, far closer than any destroyer is supposed to go. The water is shallow, the coastline mined, and the German guns are still active. But there's no choice. The infantry is dying, and the artillery has the range to change everything. He gives a single command. Bring us in. Full ahead, engines roar. The ship surges forward into the smoke. Every man aboard braces, not just for enemy fire, but for grounding, for mines, for the unknown. Nearby, the USS McCook under Commander Ralph L. Ramey follows suit. Within minutes, two destroyers, Satterley and McCook, are driving directly into the inferno of Omaha. As they approach, German artillery locks on. Shells crash into the water, throwing geysers of white spray across their decks. Machine guns spark from the cliffs. Tracers flicker like wasps through the mist, but the destroyers hold their line. The rangefinders begin to adjust, the gunnery officers shouting bearings through smoke-filled air. Target 400 yards inland. Bunker on the left flank. Range 900. The first 5-inch shells scream across the surf. They land with thunder, ripping through concrete and steel. From the beach below, pinned soldiers look up and see salvation arrive in flashes of light. Each destroyer shell carves a hole in the German defenses. Gun nests vaporized, mortar pits silenced. The tide of battle begins to tilt. At 9:20, McCook's guns find a deadly rhythm. One salvo, then another. Their 5-inch cannons pound the bluff so close that fragments of German bunkers rain onto the sand. Infantry officers on the beach begin directing the naval guns by radio, shouting corrections under fire. This is dog green. Shift 50 yards right. Fire for effect. The destroyers obey instantly. Boom. 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 Precision fire slamming into positions that had slaughtered hundreds only minutes before. To the Germans, this is unthinkable. They had expected the sea to remain distant. An observer, not a participant. But now the sea itself is striking back. Their communication lines crumble. Their gunners abandon posts as naval shells collapse the very earth around them. And then, silence. A brief, impossible silence. The U.S. infantry, hidden behind wreckage and corpses, realizes the machine guns are no longer firing. One soldier, Private First Class Henry Rickmeyer of the 116th Infantry, later recalled, "When those destroyers opened up, we felt like God himself was finally on our side." Small groups begin to move, crawling first, then running. Rangers climb the cliffs covered by naval fire so close it shakes their helmets. By 1,000 hours, U.S. troops are breaking through the wire, clearing the trenches and throwing grenades into bunkers still smoking from destroyer fire. Omaha is no longer a slaughter. It's a battle turning, and it's being rewritten by two steel ships that refuse to stay back. Omaha Beach, 10:30 hours. The smoke begins to thin. The tide has turned, literally and tactically. The destroyers continue their relentless assault. From the decks of the USS McCook, each gun crew works in rhythm. Shells loaded, barrels glowing. The concussion of the 5-inch guns shakes the ship from bow to stern, but no one stops. They've crossed every safety limit. The barrels are overheating, the recoil mounts groaning, but there's no time to care. Omaha is still on the line. The USS Carmick, USS Doyle, and USS Emmons soon join the charge, forming a deadly semicircle around the beachhead. 5 destroyers now, all within 1,000 yards of the shore, pouring fire into the bluffs with surgical precision. They're so close, one officer later said, "We could see the Germans running between their trenches." Each broadside erases another strong point. Pillboxes crumble. Communication bunkers disintegrate. Ammunition dumps explode in plumes of black smoke that roll across the cliffs like thunderclouds. The German defenders, men of the 352nd Infantry Division, are caught between two worlds: the unrelenting naval bombardment from the sea, and the advancing Americans from the sand. Their field commander, General Dietrich Kreis, realizes too late that the battle plan is collapsing. Reports flood in from the observation posts above Vierville-sur-Mer and Colleville. One by one, strong points report out of action. The coastal line that was meant to repel any invasion for 1,000 years is unraveling in under an hour. By 10:45, a new sound joins the chaos, the low growl of American Sherman tanks finally making it ashore. After hours of struggle, engineers have cleared narrow lanes through the underwater obstacles. The destroyers shift their fire inland, pounding roads and supply lines to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. From the cliffs above, a German artillery officer shouts into his field phone, "Feuer einstellen! The beach guns are gone! They're all gone!" On the beach, Captain Joe Dawson of the 16th Infantry leads his men up the embankment near Colville. Behind him, wounded soldiers drag themselves forward, following the smoke trails of the naval bombardment, each crater, each shattered bunker, a step closer to survival. Aboard the USS Satterley, Commander McCarthy receives a radio message from the Rangers at Point du Hoc. "We're at the top. Enemy strongpoints neutralized. Continue support fire inland." For the first time all morning, there's a sense of momentum, not chaos, not retreat, but movement. The tide that had once washed up bodies now carries the first supplies of victory. Ammo crates, stretchers, and medics. At 1100, the destroyers push their barrels inland another 1,000 yards. Now they're targeting German artillery batteries near Formigny and Treviers, the same guns that had rained death on the beach hours before. Their salvos land deep, scattering the 352nd's reserves before they can regroup. Meanwhile, on land, the Americans finally break through the wire. Combat engineers plant explosive charges on the remaining bunkers. The last MG-42 positions fall silent one after another. Lieutenant John Spaulding of the 116th later recalled, "It felt like the earth itself was fighting for us. Every explosion from the destroyers pushed us forward. Without them, Omaha would have been our grave." By midday, the once invincible Atlantic wall along Omaha is fractured and burning. Columns of smoke rise like funeral pyres from the German positions. The destroyers, having fired over 1,000 rounds between them, begin to slow their barrage, conserving shells as U.S. troops reach the top of the bluffs. At 1300 hours, the first Allied flags are raised above the cliffs. The sound of naval fire finally fades into the distance. replaced by the crackle of small arms as the Americans secure the high ground. The German defenders, scattered and leaderless, retreat inland toward the hedgerows of Normandy. From the bridge of the USS McCook, Commander Ramey watches through binoculars as the infantry advance. His ship's deck is scorched, the barrels warped, the crew exhausted, but Omaha stands. A signal comes from headquarters aboard the Augusta. Beachhead secured. Maintain position. Excellent work. No cheers follow, only silence. The kind that comes after surviving something that shouldn't have been possible. The destroyers turn slowly away, their hulls scarred and decks littered with spent shells. As they retreat to deeper waters, they pass over the same waves that had been red with blood only hours before. Now they reflect the pale gray light of victory. Omaha Beach is secure, not because of superior planning or overwhelming numbers, but because a handful of destroyers defied orders, defied doctrine, and brought their guns to within sight of the sand. The German slaughterhouse had become an American foothold, the impossible made possible by steel, courage, and the sea itself. When the guns finally fell silent on the evening of June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach no longer resembled a beach. It was a graveyard of twisted metal, burning vehicles, and the dead. More than 2,000 Americans had been killed, wounded, or gone missing, but the beachhead was theirs. The miracle was not in the numbers, but in the survival. What should have been a total annihilation had turned, almost inexplicably, into a victory. Across the channel, Allied command posts began receiving fragmentary reports. Omaha secure. Few believed it at first. For hours, communications had described disaster. Units pinned down, tanks destroyed, men drowning under machine gun fire. Eisenhower's staff had even begun discussing contingency evacuations. But then came the messages from the destroyers, calm, precise, and resolute. Enemy positions neutralized. Infantry advancing. Beachheads stabilized. The naval logs would later show how critical those ships had been. Between them, 5 U.S. destroyers, McCook, Carmick, Doyle, Emmons, and Satterley, fired more than 2,800 rounds in under 3 hours. Many of those shells were fired at less than half their safe distance. The McCook alone was within 800 yards of the shore, so close that small arms fire from German positions clattered harmlessly off her hull. The result was devastation. Aerial reconnaissance on June 7th showed the once formidable German strongpoints, the Widerstandsnester, completely flattened. Bunkers that had resisted air bombardment and pre-dawn shelling were now open craters. The intricate trench systems of the 352nd Infantry Division were erased from the map. The price, however, had been high. The destroyers' decks were scorched, their gun crews physically broken from the relentless firing. Many suffered ruptured eardrums, burns, and exhaustion, but every man aboard knew what they had done. They had saved the invasion. German reports from the same day tell another story, one of confusion and disbelief. The coastal defense logs from General Kreis's division note the destroyer's intervention in stunned language. Feuer von See ununterbrochen. Kein Kontakt zur Artillerie. Stellung ausgefallen. Continuous fire from the sea. No contact with artillery. Position destroyed. By the evening, German communications between Vierville and Formigny had collapsed. Artillery batteries were silenced or out of ammunition. The 352nd's frontline troops, who had believed they could repel the landings, were left stranded without command or support. For the Americans on Omaha, the price of that salvation was visible everywhere. Corpsmen worked through the night collecting the wounded. Engineers cleared the wreckage of burned-out tanks, amphibious tractors, and landing craft that now formed an accidental seawall. Aboard the destroyers, the exhausted crews cleaned their decks of spent shell casings, some piling knee-high near the guns. They had fought a naval battle against land, and won. By dawn of June 7th, the invasion fleet stood off the coast in full command of the channel. Landing craft moved freely. Reinforcements poured in. The foothold in Normandy, bought with blood, steel, and defiance, was secure. Yet even amid victory, there was a heavy quiet among the survivors. Many officers and sailors aboard the destroyers never spoke publicly about what they had done that day. They had not been heroes by plan, only by necessity. In later years, historians would argue that without those destroyers, Omaha Beach might have failed, and with it, the entire D-Day invasion. The landings at Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword would still have taken place. But the loss of Omaha could have fractured the Allied line, delayed the advance into Normandy, and possibly given the Germans the time they needed to regroup along the Seine. Instead, a handful of ships, men guided by instinct, not orders, one changed history, and in doing so, they turned what was nearly a slaughter into the foundation of liberation. In the days following D-Day, official reports began to circulate through Allied command channels. Most were cautious, statistics, positions, casualty figures, but buried in those documents were brief, glowing notes about the destroyers that had provided decisive fire support under extreme risk. It would take years before the full story became widely understood. In the chaos of the invasion, few outside Omaha Beach realized just how close the operation had come to collapse. Eisenhower's own post-action summary would later acknowledge, quietly but unequivocally, that the naval gunfire support proved the margin between defeat and success. Rear Admiral Carleton Bryant, who commanded the destroyer screen, later described what he had witnessed through his binoculars that morning. Those ships were firing so close to the beach I thought they'd run themselves aground. But without them, the men on that sand would not have survived. The soldiers who had been trapped beneath the bluffs remembered the same. Survivors from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions told how the destroyer's shells walked up the cliffs, smashing bunkers that no tank or artillery piece could reach. One sergeant from the 116th Regiment recalled looking up from a crater just in time to see the German machine gun nest above him vanish in a flash of flame and smoke. "That's when we started to move again," he said. That's when Omaha changed. In Germany, reports filtered back through surviving officers of the 352nd Infantry Division. Many had fought until their ammunition was exhausted. Their post-battle statements revealed disbelief that Allied ships could operate so close to the coast. One gunner, captured days later, said, "We thought it was madness. But they did it, and that's when we knew it was over." By mid-June, the Allies had linked the beaches, secured deep inland positions, and begun their push toward Caen. The success at Omaha became a rallying point, a testament to courage, adaptability, and the deadly precision of naval gunnery under pressure. Yet for decades, the destroyer's role remained a footnote in broader D-Day histories. Films, books, and memorials focused on the infantry's heroism, rightly so, but seldom mentioned the ships that had turned the tide from the sea. Only with declassified records and first-hand accounts did historians begin to piece together the magnitude of what those crews had achieved. In later commemorations, veterans of the USS McCook, Carmack, and Emmons were finally recognized for their actions. Many received the Navy Unit Commendation for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy shore defenses. Others never lived to see their valor acknowledged. In the post-war years, the lessons from Omaha reshaped naval doctrine. The value of close, coordinated fire support between sea and land was now undeniable. Destroyers became indispensable in amphibious operations across the Pacific, where they repeated the same daring coastal assaults off Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Strategically, Omaha proved that flexibility and initiative, not rigid adherence to orders, could decide the fate of massive operations. The destroyer captains had acted on instinct, guided only by their view of men dying on the beach. They broke formation, defied protocols, and risked their ships to do what needed to be done. It was a reminder that even in the largest war humanity had ever fought, individual courage and judgment could still alter history. By the war's end, many of those destroyers bore the scars of battle, patched hulls, warped gun barrels, and names etched into steel plates on memorials from Normandy to Norfolk. They stood as floating proof that victory at Omaha was not won by plans alone, but by men willing to improvise when everything else failed. In every D-Day commemoration since, amid the flags and ceremonies, there's a quiet pause when the naval guns of Allied ships are mentioned. It's a moment for those who fought from the sea, men whose names are seldom known but whose actions saved thousands. Their fire didn't just clear the bluffs of Normandy. It cleared the path to Europe's liberation. History often remembers the soldiers who stormed the beaches, faces in grainy photographs charging through surf and smoke. But the story of Omaha reminds us that victory is rarely the work of one kind of hero. Sometimes it comes from those whose courage is measured not in distance crossed, but in decisions made under fire. The destroyer captains who turned their guns inland that morning, men like Commander Ernest Evans and Commander Gordon Thomas, didn't wait for orders or assurances. They saw the line breaking and chose to act. That defiance, that instinct to protect the men ashore even at the cost of their ships, became one of D-Day's quiet miracles. From miles offshore, they transformed chaos into momentum, steel and precision answering desperation with salvation. In the grand arc of the war, Omaha Beach became a symbol of determination against impossible odds. But beneath that symbol lies the human truth. Victory was not inevitable. It was built moment by moment by those who refused to let fear dictate their choices. The naval gunfire that silenced the German strongpoints also silenced doubt. It proved that adaptability, not perfection, wins wars. That courage is not always about advancing. Sometimes it's about standing firm, holding your ground, and firing until the last shell is spent. When the smoke finally cleared and the tide carried back the debris of battle, the destroyers slowly pulled away, battered, exhausted, but victorious. Their guns were quiet again. The beaches were secure, and the path to Europe's liberation had begun. Today, when we look back on June 6, 1944, we see not just the scale of the operation, the thousands of men, the machines, the strategy, but the heartbeat of improvisation that kept it alive. For every plan that faltered, there was a hand that steadied it. For every silence of command, there was a voice that acted. And for every moment when defeat seemed certain, someone, somewhere turned their guns inland.